Welcome back to Capital Gains, where we break down the complex world of business, finance, and politics. Today, we're diving deep into the ongoing war in Ukraine.
Yeah, and we're not focusing on the typical headlines. We're taking our usual capital gains approach here.
Exactly. We're going to uncover how this conflict, half a world away, is actually hitting you financially right here at home.
It's all connected, you know.
Absolutely. So let's see, what do we have to work with today? Looks like you sent over excerpts from Wikipedia on a whole bunch of things.
A whole bunch, yeah.
European Union, Georgia, Iran, NATO, even North Korea.
And don't forget the timeline of the Russian invasion itself, of course.
Right. And some background on the United States and Vladimir Putin, too. Looks like we've got a pretty dense geopolitical puzzle to piece together.
We do.
But hey, that's what we do here at Capital Gains.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to trace the financial ripple effects of this war.
Yep. We'll explore how decisions made in Brussels, Moscow, and everywhere in between are impacting you.
Think rising prices at the gas pump, shifting global power dynamics, the whole shebang.
It's fascinating, really. You see, this war is reshaping the global landscape in ways we haven't seen since the Cold War.
Right.
Alliances are shifting, economies are adapting, and like any major disruption, there are clear winners and losers emerging.
And we're going to help you, our listeners, figure out where you stand in all of this.
Exactly.
Okay, let's dive right in. The invasion itself began in early 2022.
Right.
But Putin had been building up to this for years, hadn't he?
Yeah, for years. He's been pushing this whole narrative about Ukraine historically being a part of Russia.
Right, claiming they're basically one and the same.
Exactly. And it wasn't just talk. In 2021, he published this whole essay arguing for this historical unity, as he called it.
I remember that.
Saying that Ukraine's sovereignty only works if they're in partnership with Russia. This wasn't just some academic musing. It was a clear signal of his intentions.
Almost like a blueprint for what was to come.
Yeah, I'd say so.
It's pretty chilling when you think about it that way.
It is.
Okay, so he invades, the West responds with sanctions, but then our notes mentioned other players getting involved.
Oh, yeah.
Georgia, Iran, even North Korea.
Things get complicated.
This is where it gets complicated, for sure. Let's start with Georgia.
Okay, so Georgia and Russia, well, they have a long and complicated history. Centuries of conflict, actually.
Right, I vaguely remember something about a war between them back in 2008.
Exactly, 2008. So their involvement here isn't surprising. It's rooted in these deep-seated tensions.
Old grudges die hard, right?
Yeah.
But Iran, they're on the other side of the world.
True, but you got to remember, Iran has been under Western sanctions for decades.
Right.
They've been isolated from the global financial system, so they see Russia as an ally in that sense.
Okay, so a common enemy brings them together.
Yeah, you could say that.
But what about North Korea? They're the ultimate hermit kingdom. How do they fit into all of this?
Well, they may be isolated, but they're not completely out of the game.
What have they been up to?
They've been increasingly vocal in their support for Russia.
Really?
They even went as far as recognizing the independence of those Russian-backed separatist states in Ukraine.
Wow.
And there are reports that they've been supplying Russia with military equipment.
So they're directly supporting the war effort.
It seems so, yeah. It's adding fuel to the fire, for sure.
Okay, so we've got this unexpected alliance forming, a real mix of players. But let's bring it back to the heart of capital gains here. How does this war, with all its global players, impact the average person? I mean, most of us aren't buying tanks and missiles.
Right, and that's where those ripple effects we've been talking about come into play.
The ripple effects.
You see, those sanctions against Russia, they've had a huge impact on global energy markets.
Okay, how so?
Well, Russia was a major energy supplier, particularly for Europe.
Right.
So when those supplies were disrupted, it led to the higher gas prices we've all been seeing.
So that's why we're paying more at the pump.
Exactly. And it's not just gas. Both Russia and Ukraine are major players in the global food market, too.
So what we're seeing at the grocery store, the rising prices there.
That's partly due to the war as well, yeah. Food prices have become much more volatile since the invasion.
It's crazy how a war thousands of miles away can directly impact what we pay for basic necessities.
That's globalization for you.
It really is.
And it doesn't stop there. The European Union, which is a massive economic bloc, has been pouring billions of euros into supporting Ukraine.
Wow.
That impacts their budget, their economies, and could even affect trade deals that impact the goods you and I buy.
So it's a chain reaction. War disrupts supplies, prices go up, governments spend more, and we all feel it in our wallets.
Exactly. And there's another layer to consider. This whole situation has really exposed Europe's dependence on Russian energy.
All right.
They've been scrambling to find alternative sources, which is a long and expensive process.
And that scramble probably creates opportunities for other countries, right?
Yeah, of course. Think of countries like Algeria or Qatar, major gas exporters. They suddenly have a lot more leverage.
Interesting. So this war is reshaping the global energy landscape in a big way.
Absolutely.
We're seeing the effects now, and they're going to be felt for years to come.
No doubt about it.
This is all pretty heavy stuff, but before we get too overwhelmed, let's take a step back and try to understand one key player here.
Okay.
We keep hearing about NATO, but what is it exactly, and how did it become so central to this conflict?
Right. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it's basically a military alliance formed back in 1949.
Okay.
Think of it as a pact between North America and Europe. If one member is attacked, the others are obligated to defend them.
So it was created during the Cold War to counter the Soviet Union.
Exactly. But here's the thing, it's still very relevant today.
Is it because Putin sees NATO as a threat?
That's a big part of it. He views NATO expansion as the West encroaching on what he considers Russia's sphere of influence.
I see.
He sees it as a direct threat.
And that's why he's so fixated on Ukraine not joining NATO.
Exactly. He wants to keep Ukraine as a buffer zone, a neutral territory between Russia and the West. He's been crystal clear that Ukraine joining NATO is a red line for him, a non-starter.
Okay, so we've got these historical tensions, a complex web of alliances, and a major power struggle playing out right before our eyes.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. It's fascinating, but also incredibly concerning.
It is concerning. And as we've been discussing, this war isn't just about geopolitics. It's having a very real impact on the global economy,
Right.
on our energy supplies, and even on the prices we pay for everyday goods.
This is where the capital gains angle really comes in. It's not just about abstract geopolitical concepts. It's about how those concepts translate into tangible consequences for all of us.
Precisely. And as we continue to explore the economic and financial fallout of this conflict, we'll see just how intertwined business, finance, and politics truly are.
Buckle up, everyone. This deep dive is just getting started.
Stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive.
We're back, ready to unpack more of this.
Ready to go deeper.
So in part one, we talked about kind of the history behind all of this.
The backstory, yeah.
The historical backdrop, and how this war is like shifting global alliances in a way that we haven't seen in a long time.
It's unprecedented, really.
It is. Now let's zoom in on the economic aftershocks, the ripple effects that are hitting businesses, governments, and of course your personal finances.
Because that's what we're all about here at Capital Gains.
Exactly.
Bringing it back to your wallet.
Bringing it back home. Okay, so one of the most immediate impacts has been on energy. I mean, it was pretty obvious from the start.
Oh, yeah. It was immediate and dramatic. I mean, remember, for years, Russia has been the main energy supplier for a huge chunk of Europe.
Yeah, especially for natural gas. They relied heavily on those Russian pipelines.
Heavily. So when the war broke out and those pipelines were disrupted, well, it created a pretty chaotic situation.
It did. I remember those early days. So much uncertainty.
Uncertainty, panic. Yeah. Think about it. You're a country that's been completely reliant on one supplier for your energy needs.
And suddenly that supplier is gone.
Gone, or at least unreliable. So you're scrambling to find new sources.
Makes sense.
But you can't just flip a switch, right?
No, definitely not. I mean, we saw that firsthand.
It's not that simple. It's a whole infrastructure thing. You need new pipelines, new deals, and all of that takes time.
And money. Lots of money.
Exactly. And that scramble, that desperate search for new suppliers, it drives up demand.
Basic economics.
Supply and demand. And when demand goes up, what happens?
Prices go up.
Prices go up. That's why we've all been feeling the pain at the gas pump. It's not just about the war itself. It's about this massive disruption of global energy flows.
I've definitely noticed it.
We all have. And here's where it gets even more interesting. This whole crisis, it's really exposed how vulnerable Europe was.
Vulnerable.
Vulnerable in the sense that they were overly reliant on a single supplier, Russia. They put all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. And when that basket got tipped over, well, they felt the consequences.
The wake-up call for sure.
A big one. And it's forcing them to rethink their energy strategy. They're now scrambling to diversify, to find new sources.
So are you saying this war is actually accelerating the shift towards renewable energy?
I think it's playing a role, definitely. It's highlighting the risks of relying on fossil fuels from a single and often unstable region.
Right.
The push for energy independence is gaining momentum. We're seeing huge investments pouring into renewables like solar and wind.
Interesting. So maybe there's a silver lining here.
Maybe. While this war is causing short-term pain at the pump, it could be a catalyst for long-term change in the energy sector. But let's not forget about food prices.
Oh, yeah. Food prices have been going crazy, too.
They have, and it's easy to forget, but before the war, Ukraine was a major agricultural powerhouse.
Right. I've heard it called the breadbasket of Europe.
Exactly. They were a leading exporter of all sorts of essential stuff. Wheat, corn, sunflower oil, you name it.
Ingredients that are in a lot of the foods we eat every day.
Exactly. And then you've got Russia, which is a key supplier of fertilizer.
Fertilizer.
Yeah, fertilizer, which is essential for agriculture worldwide. So you see, both countries play a vital role in the global food system. And when you disrupt those supply chains, the whole world feels it. We're seeing it play out in rising food prices, especially for basic staples like bread and cereals.
Makes sense.
It's a tough situation. Consumers are already dealing with higher energy costs, and now food is getting more expensive too.
This is where that capital gains angle really hits home. It's not just about abstract geopolitical stuff. It's about the concrete impact on our wallets, on our ability to afford the things we need.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And this impact, it goes beyond individuals, too.
Oh, yeah, businesses are hurting, too, right?
Absolutely. Think about all the companies that rely on imported ingredients or raw materials that come from Ukraine or Russia.
Like food manufacturers, for example.
Exactly. They're facing higher costs, supply chain disruptions, and a whole lot of uncertainty about the future. It's a ripple effect across the entire economy. And then you've got governments stepping in with all sorts of measures.
Trying to manage the crisis.
Sanctions, aid packages, it adds another layer of complexity to the whole situation.
It does.
You've got the United States leading the charge with sanctions on Russia. They're targeting individuals, businesses, entire sectors of the Russian economy.
And the goal is to pressure Russia to change course to stop the war.
Right. By squeezing their economy.
But sanctions are a tricky thing, aren't they?
They are. It's like a double-edged sword.
How so?
Well, you're trying to target specific actors, the people in power, but there are often unintended consequences.
Yeah, I can see that.
Sanctions can end up hurting ordinary citizens, the very people you're trying to help. And they can even backfire on the countries imposing them.
Backfire?
Yeah, by pushing the targeted country closer to its allies, making them more defiant.
It's a risky strategy.
It is. A high-stakes game of chess. Everyone's trying to anticipate the next move and minimize the damage.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It is. And then you've got the other side of the equation, the massive amount of aid that's flowing into Ukraine.
Right.
Billions and billions of dollars, both financial and military aid.
Which, again, has ripple effects on budgets, on trade deals, on the global arms market. It's a whole other set of consequences to consider.
Exactly. It's all interconnected, you see. This war has really exposed these hidden dependencies, these vulnerabilities in the global system. And now governments and businesses are trying to adapt.
They're scrambling to figure things out, to navigate this new reality.
Exactly. It's like someone pulled back the curtain, revealing all the gears and levers of the global economy.
And now we're all trying to figure out how it works.
More than that, we're trying to figure out who benefits, who loses out, and how this conflict is shifting those power dynamics.
Well, it's a lot to process.
It is. So we've got this energy crisis, a food crisis, a sanctions war, a massive aid effort. It's a lot to digest. But there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to look at.
What's that?
The financial markets. How are they reacting to all this uncertainty?
Yeah, that's a good question. Markets hate uncertainty.
They do, and this war has created a whole lot of it. We've seen stock markets go up and down like a yo-yo, commodity prices going haywire. It's a roller coaster ride.
And I imagine investors are pretty nervous right now.
Of course they are. They're trying to assess the long-term implications of this war. Is this a short-term shock that the markets will eventually absorb? Or are we witnessing a fundamental shift in the global order?
Big questions.
Huge questions, and nobody really knows the answer yet.
It's all speculation at this point.
It is. But here's the thing. Even if the war ended tomorrow, the world has already changed.
Please how?
The pre-war global order, with its intricate web of economic connections, it's been disrupted.
Disrupted?
The energy landscape is shifting as Europe tries to wean itself off Russian gas.
Right.
Supply chains are being reconfigured as businesses diversify their sourcing, trying to avoid future disruptions. This isn't just a temporary blip. It's a systemic change with lasting consequences. And it's not just about going back to how things were before. It's about adapting to this new reality, trying to mitigate the negative consequences.
Okay, so a lot to think about there. We've covered a lot of ground in this part.
We have.
The energy crunch, the food crisis, the sanctions war, the impact on financial markets. It's clear this war is having a profound impact on the global economy, and the consequences are still unfolding.
They are. And as we move into our final part, we're going to explore some potential scenarios for the future.
All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive, and you know what we're all about here at Capital Games.
Getting to the bottom of things.
Exactly, getting to the bottom of things. We've dug into the history.
The geopolitics.
The global economic fallout of this war.
It's been a wild ride.
It has.
Yeah.
Now, the million-dollar question.
What next?
What does the future hold? Can we even predict anything in this crazy world?
Well, predicting the future is always a risky business.
That's for sure.
Especially with something as complex and as volatile as this war. But I think we can explore some potential scenarios.
Okay.
Look at the possibilities, both optimistic and pessimistic, just to get a sense of where things could go.
Sounds good. So let's start with the best-case scenario. Is there a path to peace here? Is there any light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, the ideal outcome, of course, would be a negotiated settlement.
A peace agreement.
Yeah, a peace agreement that addresses the concerns of both sides. But getting there, that's the challenge.
There's a lot of bad blood.
There is. A lot of mistrust. A lot of damage has been done.
So even if they could agree, what would a settlement even look like? What kind of concessions would have to be made?
Well, on the Russian side, they'd likely demand some serious security guarantees from NATO.
Like what?
Like a promise that Ukraine would never join the alliance. They see NATO expansion as a direct threat, an existential threat to their security.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier.
Right. And for Ukraine, well, they'd have to make some tough decisions, too.
They've already lost Crimea. Parts of their territory are still occupied. It's hard to imagine them accepting any further concessions.
It is. And that's the heart of the problem.
It's their land.
It is. And for them, this is about survival, about their very existence as a nation. Compromising on their territorial integrity, well, that would be a very bitter pill to swallow.
So even if they do reach a peace agreement, which seems like a long shot at this point, the road to recovery would be long and painful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Rebuilding a country after a war like this is a monumental task.
You're talking about infrastructure, refugees, the whole economy needing to be rebuilt.
The whole thing. It takes years, decades even, to truly heal those wounds. And what about the global economic consequences?
Right.
Will things ever go back to normal?
That's a good question.
Well, that's the thing. I don't think there is a back to normal anymore. The world has fundamentally changed. The pre-war global order, the way things were before, that's over.
So it's not just a temporary blip. This is a permanent shift.
I think so. The energy landscape is shifting as Europe scrambles to find alternatives to Russian gas.
Right.
Supply chains are being reconfigured as businesses try to diversify their sourcing, reduce their risk. This isn't just about going back to how things were. It's about adapting to a new reality. It's about mitigating the negative consequences of this seismic shift.
Okay, so that's the optimistic scenario. A fragile peace with a long road to recovery.
And a lot of uncertainty.
But what if things don't go that way? What's the worst case scenario?
The worst case scenario, well, that's a prolonged conflict, potentially escalating into a wider war.
Drawing in other countries.
Exactly. And that would be catastrophic.
For everyone.
For everyone, not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for the entire world. We're talking global conflict.
Devastation.
Human suffering. Economic collapse.
Yeah.
Imagine energy prices skyrocketing, food shortages becoming widespread. The global economy plunges into a deep recession. It's not a pretty picture.
It's a scary thought.
It is. It's something we all hope to avoid, but it's a possibility we have to acknowledge.
So we've got this whole spectrum of possibilities, from a fragile peace to a potential global catastrophe. And the decisions that are made in the coming months and years, they're going to determine which path we take.
That's the reality of our world today. Everything's interconnected. What happens in one corner of the globe has ripple effects everywhere.
This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. I've learned so much about how complex this conflict really is and how it's impacting all of our lives, whether we realize it or not.
And that's what Capital Gains is all about. Demystifying these complex issues, connecting the dots between geopolitics, finance, and your everyday life.
And for our listeners, I think the takeaway here is pretty clear. Stay informed. Stay engaged. Understand that even a war thousands of miles away can have a real impact on your finances, on your life.
We live in a globalized world. What happens over there matters over here.
Absolutely. Decisions made in government halls and boardrooms on battlefields, they all shape our lives in ways we might not even realize. So pay attention, ask questions, and stay curious.
That's the best way to navigate this uncertain world.
Couldn't agree more. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Kind of one day.
Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into the world of capital gains.